welcome to Neon Liberalism, a weekly podcast where myself, Samantha Hancox-Lee, and my friend Jason Brigman try to provide a liberal perspective on the events of the week and, hopefully to take a step back from some of the noise and see the bigger picture. This week, I was hoping to talk about this whole economic populism question. We've seen, since Harris's loss, a variety of Democrats have suggested that, Democrats have betrayed the working class, as Bernie Sanders put it, that they've strayed too far from their roots. And if we return to economic populism, then Democrats will once again win back the working class, win elections, and so forth. So I guess I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what is economic populism? What does it mean? What's going on here? So I don't know, Jason, what is economic populism?
Very good question. I think conventionally it's thought of as somehow creating an image at the very least, or a reality in a stronger sense, of the public or the people as opposed to the elites, that there is strong economic tension between the interests of the one and those of the other, not a strain of thinking that we associate with the last several decades, I suppose, commonly referred to as neoliberal economic era, in which, lots of speaking of a rising tide lifting all boats and so forth, right? So the idea of a stronger opposition between the interests of the workers and the elites is what I take to be the essence of it. What about you, Samantha?
Well, what do I think? I mean, I think that's certainly one strain of economic populism. I guess to give it a little more context, I want to talk a bit first about that neoliberal consensus you'd mentioned. I mean, you're the economics professor here, so I'm told. So what is the neoliberal consensus? I mean, people throw that word around all the time, neoliberalism. So it can seem sometimes to mean almost nothing at all. But maybe there is some kind of large economic regime, economic consensus that dominated political thinking for the past couple of decades. What is that?
I would say freeing up trade, reduction in regulation, faith that the level of redistribution and the distributional problems will sort of mostly work themselves out in the long run, sort of not overwhelming concern about seeing jobs shift, not much concern about seeing the size of industries shifting, manufacturing moving overseas, sort of viewing that as ultimately, sort of a shaking out of an international division of labor, and that it'll all work out again in this sort of notion of a rising tide lifting all boats. I mean, I think that would be a real basic summation of what that word is thought to stand for.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right to me, that the neoliberal idea is, the government withdrawing from kind of shaping the economy, withdrawing from, strong government intervention and stuff like national price controls or regulations on trade or maintenance of, preferred industries. And like you say, just kind of letting the markets sort it out. And there are a variety of lovely, microeconomic proofs that actually this would be all to the good for everybody, right? That like you said, the rising tide would lift all boats, economic growth, it would be good for everyone, that all kinds of distributional conflicts could work themselves out in various ways. I do kind of want to note, just on a, to get on my personal hobby horse about housing, that as much as we talk about the neoliberal era as an era of totally free markets, there were a lot of areas in which markets were not free at all. Housing being one of them, and in many ways being kind of a pillar of the neoliberal era. Right, that we were going to construct homeownership as a protected asset class. And we were going to engage in a certain kind of macroeconomic policy to protect asset classes. This is kind of an argument drawn from Melinda Cooper and others, that part of what's going on here is that macroeconomic management in this period says we're going to run kind of a cool economy, right? We're going to tolerate some level of unemployment as long as we have very carefully managed inflation. And in order to compensate people for this, we're going to make sure that homeowners, that the price of their assets keeps going up. And the, expansion in consumer credit kind of lets people leverage those assets into greater spending, right? Even without running a hot economy. So that's another kind of picture that gets progress, arguably, beyond the free market ideology and into like the some of the actual operations of how the, again, the quote neoliberal consensus operated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want to take that second step and get past, say, okay, what's the surface reputation? And maybe there's some big picture truth to what I was saying about like what we think is meant by neoliberal consensus. But, like you mentioned, housing, we could go further and just say land use in general.
Absolutely.
Longtime listeners of neon liberalism will know I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas. And I can tell you that in Texas, transportation is not a free market realm. The Texas Department of Transportation determines where transportation is going to go, how incredibly wide highways are going to be, and so forth. And so, you can go from housing to land use in general, and that embraces transportation in so many ways. And these are, heavily not just regulated, but even government directed areas of the economy, important areas of the economy. And the whole neoliberal era really sort of turns a blind eye to that. Texas is just sort of amazing. No amount of spending on highways and no width of highways is sufficient in this state that is renowned for the reign of the free market, and it's unbelievable how, if you haven't been here, you probably have no idea how high in the sky a highway of several lanes needs to be to go over empty land. You probably just have no idea how necessary that is because you've probably never seen it. I mean, I've been in Pennsylvania, Samantha, and your roads are ground bound. I mean, they are stuck on the earth where the earth is
Yeah,
empty.
we go through the mountains, and if we just thought of going over the mountains, it would have solved
way over. It's really hard to grasp how high some of these highways are up in the sky.
Yeah, I guess that's going to be my pitch to the Pittsburgh City Council is that the Liberty Tunnel is always crowded, so we need to build the new Liberty Bridge that just goes over Mount Washington. It'll be a great jobs program too, while we're at it. But anyways, just to get away from the jokes a little bit, yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of core to the actual reality, again, of the neoliberal consensus is that we talk a lot about free markets, and there are certain areas which are just like, yeah, we're going to let the free market sort it out. But then there are other places where we're going to have very strong government intervention and control over the economy. Land use being one of them, being one of the most important ones, but there are some others. We could talk about those. Regardless, the neoliberal era kind of starts to crack up in recent years. The consensus about neoliberalism, whatever that means, starts to break down. And for me, I see this mostly coming out of the Great Recession, where, the Great Recession, there is a bank panic, basically. And the government says, we are going to let that happen. Let the fire clear out the dead wood. And then people really start to panic after Lehman Brothers goes down. The government says, okay, well, maybe we've actually got a recession on our hands. So we'll have to do some stimulus. But there's an enormous amount of worry in the Obama administration among economists that, Larry Summers kind of famously, that the stimulus can't be too big. Right. There are Democratic politicians who say we can't possibly break $1 trillion on the stimulus. That's just too high of a nominal price tag. And so the response to the Great Recession is pretty anemic. And the result is the great part of the Great Recession, where we have years and years of high unemployment, low growth, terrible economy. Nobody likes it.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing that the dates of this recession are always given as 2008, 2009. And, there's among economists, there's a technical definition of recession, which is the time during which the economy is actively shrinking. And then there's the casual sense, which we generally speak of recessions, which sort of incorporates the ensuing recovery. And we sort of think of that all as like the period when times were not that good because we hadn't even got back to where we were. And by a lot of measures, you're not back to where you were out of that recession until 2013, right? So the anemic recovery, of course, is huge in what we think of as being that period, that recession, right? But it's amazing that people say, oh yeah, 2008, 2009. It's like, no, but usually we're thinking about that period when the recovery was so poor as well, which went on much longer.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of see both some aspects of the neoliberal consensus kind of breaking down here, right? In the sense of like, well, free markets, we just let the market sort out which banks are going to be solvent and which aren't. And then, you get a bank run. And then, they say, okay, well, we have to be really careful to run to not overheat the economy. We can't have inflation. We can't do too much fiscal stimulus. And what do we get? We get a recession. And so when it comes to COVID, there's an enormous dislocation to the American economy, to the world economy, very different from the property bubble bank run of the Great Recession, but still an enormous shock to the system. And this time around, policymakers were willing to pull out every single stop to do something about it, right? To just absolutely shotgun money at the American economy to make sure it recovered as fast as possible, to provide income supports to people who are out of work, all kinds of creative policy tools that were totally verboten under the neoliberal thinking. And it works pretty well, right? America has a great recovery. I mean, compared to our peer countries, a very rapid recovery from COVID, much better than our peer competitors. And so it feels very much like we're out of the neoliberal consensus, right? That we're in an era where there's questions once again open about how we are going to run this economy we've got here.
Yeah, and questions that are just cracked further wide open by the highly interesting ideas coming out of the incoming Trump administration, of course, right? Proposing an entire refounding of the American government revenue sources toward tariffs away from income taxes and on and on. So clearly a lot of rethinking, or at least potential redoing. How much thinking is going on, not totally clear all the time, but absolutely, like you can trace, the sort of like breakdown to the historical events you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to linger on Bidenomics a little bit more, we also see under Biden, we have Build Back Better, we have the Infrastructure Act, we have the CHIPS Act, where there's a much more explicit return to governmental industrial policy that says we don't want the free market to answer all these questions. We need to have a chips industry in America. We need to have a batteries industry in America. We want to have a green power industry in America. And the government is going to step in and use a lot of money to make that happen.
So COVID and that recession, that shock shone an extremely bright light on supply chains. And lo and behold, when you sort of shrug at international movements of capital and industry and so forth, you end up maybe with, the computer chips that we're extremely reliant on are all made in Taiwan. And
yeah, I mean, the stats on that are really kind of astounding. That, as you probably know, pretty much everything you use in your daily life, your phone, obviously, your computer, obviously, but your car, right? One of the big bottlenecks for car production early in the pandemic wasn't steel, it wasn't rubber, it was computer chips, right? And something like 80%, I mean, you can look up the figures yourselves, but something like 80% of advanced computer chips are made in Taiwan specifically, one island. And we will talk about this someday on the podcast, but an island with a certain amount of geopolitical risk attached to it.
It's almost like an implication of that caricature, or whatever you want to say, of neoliberal economic policy that we put out there. Like, if you're going to be tolerant, happy, satisfied with industries locating wherever in the world they may care to locate, and even in the example of chips, become completely dominated by a company that is on Taiwan, right? It almost commits you to creating the international relations with Taiwan, probably with mainland China, that will sustain that industry and your access to it, because without that underpinning of those good relations, you're going to have some problems, right? But apparently we have a lot of politicians on all sides that enjoy, sort of rattling their sabers at one another. And this doesn't create stability in those supply chains. And so it calls your economic policy back into question when you're not willing to run the geopolitical policy that would be required to sort of keep things in order.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we've talked kind of about the domestic reasons that the neoliberal era, the neoliberal consensus is breaking up. But I mean, we don't really have to belabor any of the points, but we're clearly heading into an era of greatly increased, to put it in something of a euphemism, geopolitical risk, right? Great power tensions, when great powers around the world are looking to redraw the map with the sword. And that takes you out of a world in which you can just think, oh yeah, of course, we'll import all of our natural gas from Russia, right? And it's fine because we're all happy friends here, and we're all just doing trade, and a rising tide lifts all boats, until the Russians say, well, actually, we want that land over there, and we're not going to give you any more gas until we get it. Or at least they tried to do that. Didn't work out so well for them. You can see China is arguably working up to try and do some of the same things, maybe in a more effective way. We'll find out. Um, Certainly we in America have tried to do some of these kinds of geopolitics via economic policy, but regardless, right, the world situation is increasingly uncertain, increasingly risky, and it's made people much more skeptical of orthodox free tradeism. Right, that's just the world we live in.
Yeah, certainly. I know a lot of people in our circles are probably reading Underground Empire by Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman. That book talks about how the United States, is actively playing these geopolitical games, but maybe not in ways that are immediately transparent, maybe not in ways that people are totally familiar with, right? But leveraging our control over the American dollar, or leveraging our control over internet hardware, literal like physical internet networks, right? And a real fascinating book, obviously, and an important book, I think.
Yeah, so obviously to kind of come back to the economics of it all, you can see Biden's industrial policy as one kind of answer to that problem, right? We're going to have large federal subsidies for the industries we want. That'll encourage them to build here. TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, has built an enormous fab in Arizona that is churning out chips as we speak. You can also see Trump's policies, Trump's proposed policies as a clear break with the neoliberal consensus and as a different way of trying to chart a new course for the economy. to put it mildly, to be, as you say, is this a coherent and well thought out policy program, or is it just he's wanted to do tariffs since 1980 because he's just has that kind of mind, that sees the world in a zero sum kind of picture, and if you are not taking advantage of someone, they must be taking advantage of you, and so therefore free trade has clearly got to be them stealing from us, and so we need to stop that, right? So he's proposed, the numbers are all over the place. I think at some point you saw, a 1,000% tariff barrier on trade with China, or maybe it's just going to be 25%, and it's going to be with Mexico and Canada for some reason. The Canadians, they're stealing our jobs, apparently. I'm just being told this right now.
And, whenever you look at policy proposals from Mr. Trump, I think you have to also ask yourself how much of this is even being sought in the national interest of the United States and how much is being sought in the personal interest of Donald Trump. We can say, he's putting on tariffs because he's playing geopolitics in the new post-neoliberal era, or you could just say he wants the entire American tax system converted into a carrot and stick apparatus that he can use to get people to stay at his hotels and do things for him personally. I mean, the guy personally profits off the presidency. We have allowed this to happen by refusing to make him sell his peanut farm, which of course in his case is much more than a peanut farm. That's a joke about Jimmy Carter. He has an enormous network of businesses called the Trump Organization. We are allowing him to run those businesses for his private benefit while he is also president of the United States, and having a system where he gets to pick and choose, like, I could slap a big tax on products from your country or not. Let's see what you do now that you have heard this, what's essentially a threat paired with a promise of a benefit, right? You can easily look at all his proposals as like something that he understands will give him a lot of power to make himself and his buddies rich and himself powerful and himself respected and adored. And you can just question whether this is geopolitics in the national interest or whether it's just tawdry self-interest in Trump's interest.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem that comes up not in the context of just American history, but in, comparative economics. When you look at how other countries have run their economies, lots of people at one time or another have tried to do national industrial policy, right? To have a much larger state intervention in the economy. We want to have this kind of economy. We're going to spend money. We're going to make it happen. We're going to have favored industries, right? That get lots of money. And you don't really need to think too hard about how this creates enormous possibilities for corruption, right? When the federal government is out there directing around, in our case, hundreds of billions of dollars and picking winners and losers, right? That creates a tremendous incentive for companies who recognize, that their fate is very much in the hands of the federal government to spend a lot of time getting cozy with government officials like Trump or his family or his associates, finding various kinds of ways to transfer money to them, right? And this is a problem that has consumed other economies around the world. Arguably, this is the problem of the Soviet Union, right? That the reason their economies stagnated was, well, they had very high government control over industry. They were picking what they wanted, heavy industry and the military. The people who ran heavy industry and the military bureaus, they liked that because it meant an enormous amount of money flowed through their control, and they could use that money to spend on themselves or on other forms of corruption. And so they could never get their economy away from heavy industry and into actually productive industries, right? So national industrial policy, it's not like this magic button that makes everything work, and we've just been too afraid to hit it. It's like, no, there are very genuine risks here, and Trump definitely seems like the embodiment of that. I mean, because we just have seen a lot of self-dealing from him already, and so that certainly seems like a risk.
Yeah, going back to the contrast with the neoliberal period, it's like you referred to the nice models that make it look like everything works out. And it's kind of like, yeah, on an infinite frictionless time horizon, everything will work out in the model, and that sort of view of things, that extremely, as we say in economics, stylized, that extremely stylized view of things, obscured the risks. And then you bring up, this transition moment of the so-called Great Recession. I detest that name, Samantha. You've forced me to say it, the Great Recession. You're unhappy. No, it sounds too much like Great Depression, and my students get confused, So I just call it the 2008, 2009 recession, which is also bad because it doesn't include the period of the weak recovery. Anyway, my point was going to be that once that period, that shock hits of that big recession, right? And you outlined it, so well, that suddenly it's like, oh, should we actually stick with our hands-off policies? And when it came to the banking crisis, and then when it came to the recession itself, the answer kind of was like, no, like they halfway stuck with, their hands off policies, right? They didn't actually let all the banks collapse. They didn't actually let the economy go completely unstimulated, right? But like you said, like the responses were halfway and they were weak. And so the recovery was weak and took forever. And so there were these risks in the neoliberal period. The risk of, whoa, these policies might not work if we actually do hit a big shock. If we actually do hit a big recession, like our supposedly favored hands-off policies will not work. And that actually itself was a risk, right? So, we can point to the risks of the new era and new industrial policy having risks, but there's going to be risks, right? It's ineradicable, as they say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think another interesting point of comparison here, something we talked about earlier, is like, was the neoliberal era about free markets and deregulation, or was it about government control? And I think you can see some of that same tension in Trump's plans, and especially now I'm going to say something that I hate to say, the Department of Government Efficiency.
How do we pronounce this acronym?
Doge, unfortunately. We all know it's pronounced Doge. Um, like I said, I hate to say it, but it is what it is. So this government bureau, unclear exactly what it is. This government something that's been proposed by
Cabal of
Trump.
billionaires that is a
It's
public-private
basically a
partnership.
cabal of billionaires, right? Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, various other kinds of billionaires are trying to get on the action now that is supposedly going to quote, quote, cut government waste.
Is Vivek a
Right.
billionaire? Let's not give him $1 billion.
Yeah, Vivek isn't a billionaire. He's just, I don't know. I mean, there's whatever. There's a story about
He's
why you
Vivek.
want two heads, right? That the whole point of this is to let Trump play people off against each other. But we'll come back to that in a second. The thing about the Department of Government Efficiency is it going to exist to cut government spending, right? That's an option. They've talked about this, right? Well, we want to cut the FDA. They want to get rid of the FDA entirely, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because they don't want people to know how bad their economy is. We're going to review various contracts. How likely do you think it is, Jason, that they're going to review SpaceX's contracts?
Now the question answers itself.
Yeah, exactly. That this is the kind of like deregulation that has historically been very easy to leverage into playing favorites, right? Who is your Department of Government Efficiency going to be looking at? Well, it's people who won't play ball, right? Whether that's companies that have large contracts with the government, well, we're going to investigate you for efficiency. Or alternatively, you could buy some of these Trump branded rocket motors or whatever it is, right? And so it's this sense that it's something that can posture at cutting the government, posture at cutting regulation, even as it is, actively being used to pick winners and losers in the economy, possibly in a corrupt way.
One interpretation of the set of appointees that Mr. Trump is making for his cabinet is they are showmen, across the board. These are people from television in large part, or people who have a knack for creating spectacle, like Matt Gaetz, maybe. And so you can sort of see the same thing with this Department of Government Efficiency. Potentially, it could be a lot of smoke and mirrors. And how many Americans really look up the facts, which would presumably would come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics or something like that, as in terms of how many government employees there are and how much government spending there is. Donald Trump could just tell a lot of his voters, yeah, we cut it, and I built the wall, and Mexico paid for it, and he could just say those things to people, and enough people will believe it. So yeah, you could definitely wonder as to how much of any sort of efficiency these people will bring about, even on their own terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to one of my big concerns about the concept of economic populism and whether economic populism can be identified with a particular policy program, which is most of what we've talked about so far, a particular package of actually existing economic policies, or is populism a style, right? Is populism branding, right? Donald Trump successfully, apparently, brands himself as a populist. Despite, being a billionaire. He's rich, right? His father was super rich. He was born rich. He's traveled in rich circles all his life. But he brands himself, as a populist, which is a bit odd, as you said, because, populism on one definition is about the conflict between the elites and the masses. But maybe that's not really it at all. Maybe it just is a matter of styling yourself as I'm going to take down the bad guys and fight for you. And that's not really any substantive economic policy where you can fit anything in there, really, if you're good at selling things.
He's the people's billionaire, Samantha. I mean, you could, extremely cynically, you could say America it's capitalism, and who's going to fight for you if not a billionaire?
I mean, cynically, but I think there's something to that, that he did win the election. He's apparently won the popular vote. Again, not an outright majority, but at least a plurality of the popular vote, right? That he was putting out something that some people wanted, some kind of outsider energy.
Well, certainly it is possible to mentally put yourself on a billionaire's team, and say, sure, maybe I'm not there right now, but I want to get there. Maybe I will get there. I think aspiration has been an important element in the Republican success, that they're encouraging, be on the side of the economy's winners, be part of the
Yeah.
team along with the rich people. And maybe just that feeling is enough for a lot of people,
I
and
mean,
for other people, maybe it's not the feeling, but it's like actually thinking that they'll get there. It's a kind of a dress for the job you want. It's like I want to be next to Donald Trump, and I'm going to support him now, and hope that I'm on my way. And maybe my turn will come, or just staying adjacent to these people. Some opportunities will fall to me. Because I'm nearby and I'm proximate and I'm part of the team. That sort of thing.
yeah, you know what they say. In America, there are no poor people. There are only temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And I mean, it's a great thing, and it does capture something about how people in this country think about themselves. For better or for worse, it is what it is. That's a possibility that I kind of want to just have in the back of our heads this whole time when we're talking about economic populism and different kinds of economic regimes, that maybe it isn't really a policy question at all, but a messaging question. Maybe we'll come back to that at the
Mm-hmm.
end. I do want to talk a little bit about a third option beyond Bidenomics, beyond Trumponomics, but the kind of populism that various Democrats have suggested we need to get back to, right? And again, this is probably most famously identified with Bernie Sanders, But and it's the kind of populism that you defined at the start of our little chat here, where well we say, okay, there's the billionaire class or the 1% or the 0.1% or whatever you want to call it, right? There's the ultra rich, and they're the problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to take their money, or at least we're going to tax them much more highly than we do now. There have been much more extreme proposals. I know one of our colleagues, Matthew Danauer, has written about this for Liberal Currents, and how Huey Long, back during the Great Depression, just explicitly proposed a wealth cap in America, right? There was just going to be a number and you couldn't have more than that. And if you had more than that right now, the government was going to take all of it, right? And that, I mean, you can certainly see that idea lurking in the background, even if it isn't really proposed by mainstream Democratic politicians. But in any event, soak the rich, right? We're going to tax them way more heavily than we do right now. And then we're going to spend that money on universal social programs, most famously Medicare for all, various other kinds of proposals out there, but that's again the biggest and most famous one. So right, that's a style of quote unquote economic populism. Thoughts?
Yeah, and I think let me put on my economist hat if it isn't always on.
Oh, what's that? You've got a hat on right now. Is that an economist hat?
This isn't a video podcast. My hat that I'm wearing right now, this is representative of Austin FC, the local soccer club. So what I was going to say is that the idea of taking a lot of wealth away from the billionaires, I think there's a group of economists, probably a fairly large group, who would be concerned and say, well, you're taking the wealth away from these people who are proven, talented allocators of capital, and you will be giving this wealth to the government, inherently not good allocators of capital, right? I think that would be the reaction of at least a sizable portion of the economics community. But a lot of developments in economics in recent years would ask questions about, how is it really revealed to us by the fact that someone is a billionaire that they are actually talented at allocating capital, right? It really neglects the role of luck. It neglects the role of starting points, right? You mentioned Donald Trump, born rich, right? And it's frequently remarked by people on the left that someone who's born rich can try, meaning they could maybe start their own business 10 different times. And if they succeed once, they'll be on their way. Do you know what I mean? Whereas someone who starts with very little might get to try one time in their life. And since luck or just unforeseeable, unknown factors in making you a business success, since that's so important, even if you are talented in allocating capital, like there's no guarantees. There's just no guarantees, right? And so I think that would be a big reaction to this idea of, a wealth cap or limiting the influence of billionaires. There will be this reaction like, well, these are the people who we know are good at doing this. And then the response might be, these are the people who have been very fortunate and we don't know to the extent whether that's talent, whether that's luck. So I think you would see that conflict right away. I mean, that's sort of view of things that we need to let the rich make decisions because they're the proven talented decision makers is strong, not just among economists, but in a lot of society.
Yeah, so I think there's certainly that argument is going to be levied against this kind of economic populism. For me, I mean, the thing that I always come back to isn't even a question of like the worth of a billionaire, or I guess I should say it is very much about the worth of a billionaire. I just Googled right now. They say Elon Musk, he was supposedly a trillionaire at one point. Right now, they say he's worth 300 something billion dollars. That's a lot of money. That's an unbelievable, almost inhumanly incomprehensible amount of money. The price tag of something like Medicare for all will run upwards of $1 trillion a year, right? If you took every drop of money Elon Musk had and you spent it all, you wouldn't get to a single year of this program. Because it turns out, billionaires, they're very rich, and that's probably a problem. But America is a very large and very rich country. And many of the universal social programs that have been proposed, people love them until they hear what the price tag is. And to some extent, we saw this with Elizabeth Warren's campaign 4 years ago in the 2020 primaries, where one of the moments when Elizabeth Warren's campaign starts tanking is when she comes out with a proposal for how she's going to pay for Medicare for all or some very similar universal healthcare program. And people looked at the actual mechanics of like, how are you going to pay for that? And they didn't like it very much. And so she was, her numbers went down pretty steadily from there. So this kind of is always the thing that worries me about economic populism generally, is that if you poll people about benefits of a proposal, then they say, yes, I want the benefits. And if you ask them about the costs, they say, no, I don't want the costs. Right? They want the good things and not the bad things. It seems like a natural, answer to a poll, but it's hard to run an economy on that basis. On just, doing opinion surveys about what specific policies people want. Um,
Yeah, it's like, do you want to eat breakfast? Yes. Do you want to pay for breakfast? No. I mean, what are we doing here? We have to eat breakfast, right? So, I'm sure Senator Warren would have said, well, look, it's worth it. The benefits are greater than the costs, so it's worth it. So we should do it. It kind of honestly, I often will think it's that simple. I want to go back to the point of the amount of money being raised by a billionaire's tax or something like that. And I would say that if the case for taxing billionaires or a wealth tax or any sort of thing that is meant to limit the accumulated wealth of billionaires, if the case is that we can use the money we get from them to fund things, then you're right, the case is not strong. But I think the case for doing something may be strong if it rests elsewhere. And the elsewhere might be in how much are billionaires able to leverage their wealth, even if it seems on paper that it is some kind of fraction of the economy, some small fraction. Even if on paper the billionaire's total aggregate wealth is some small fraction of the country's wealth, right? Is it the case, though, that a lot of, a decent fraction of wealth in a very small number of hands can be leveraged to immense amount of control? And I don't know, man. Look at the last election. Ask
oh,
ourselves
absolutely.
why did he seemingly leverage so much impact, over the last couple of years? Why was he able to buy Twitter? Why did that make such a difference? Why is he single-handedly funding the campaign for president? Why is he at the president-elect's side? If his wealth is a drop in the bucket of national wealth, answer me this: how is this possible? How is this happening? Right? And
No,
there may be answers in economic analysis. I just want to propose, it's a classic point in public choice economics, the idea of concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. If the benefit to Musk can land on Musk, and Musk is already self-organized. He's organized within himself, right? Like it's hard for, when the costs are diffuse among many people, it's hard for them to organize and get something done, right? Elon Musk doesn't have this problem. What I'm suggesting is, yeah, we might add up the wealth of all the billionaires, and it might look like a small fraction of the country's wealth, but maybe their advantages in the public choice sense let them leverage that.
I absolutely agree. This is very much my position that billionaires are, or extreme inequalities of wealth are dangerous because they're politically dangerous. Like, I don't think the economic case is necessarily there in the sense of like, there's just not enough money there to pay for large universal programs that have price tags in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But at the same time, I mean, as you say, as Musk clearly shows, there are genuine political dangers in the extreme concentrations of wealth. We can see that in the last election, and we can see this just across history in various kinds of societies that have had problems becoming increasingly dominated by extreme concentrations of wealth. So I think there's a strong argument for increasing tax rates of various kinds to try and mitigate wealth inequality. Is that economic populism? Well, it's a good idea. So, one thing I kind of want to talk about in the end here, as we're getting towards the end of our little discussion, is the abundance liberalism. You may have heard of it. Abundance liberalism is just going to be the name I use here. Various other kinds of names are given to it. But this faction that kind of looks at the neoliberal consensus and really focuses more heavily on that state intervention in the economy, on housing, on permitting, on the way that environmental laws are being used to block clean energy. right? The town I grew up in, where a plant that would have made wind turbine blades was blocked by a couple of angry homeowners with a lot of money that they could spend suing to say that, oh, you haven't done a careful enough
Yeah,
environmental impact assessment.
they want to save the birds, you know?
Apparently they want to save the birds. The Minneapolis, I want to say Minneapolis 2030, 2040, one of their new housing plans was blocked by a few homeowners filing a lawsuit saying you haven't done analysis to show that increasing the density of housing is going to have an impact on yada yada, on the shadows or whatever made up environmental, harm that they're running with these days. All right, so the abundance liberals are going to say, well, look, there's a lot of stuff in our economy that is fundamentally about creating artificial scarcity, right? About blocking things from getting built, whether that's housing, whether that's green energy, other kinds of artificial scarcity, occupational licensing. Maybe we'll talk about that someday, right? And what we should do as Democrats is get rid of all this harmful, this deliberately harmful regulation that serves to enrich, like you were saying, distributed costs, concentrated benefits that serves to enrich, some small group of people. Yeah, I can see you're making a face about that.
No, I was agreeing with you. Yeah.
And this will enable, greater economic growth, greater returns in a more broadly shared way, and, will, so to put it one way, expand the tax base, give us more money to spend on universal social programs, whether that's something like universal basic income or free higher education or universal health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's certainly another reaction to the breakup of the so-called neoliberal consensus, another path forward for the American economy. Although, I don't know, your thoughts on that?
Right. It kind of sounds like becoming more serious about the aspects of the neoliberals, for lack of a better word, the old neoliberal economy, becoming more serious about the aspects that that era wasn't taking an open economy very seriously. There's a lot more we can do to open the economy, to open opportunity, and pointing directly at housing, pointing as you did at education. There's a moment there coming out of World War II, the GI Bill, and, like becoming a more educated public. And you can definitely argue that not so much has been done in that direction of late for various reasons. But, the opportunity could be there to do more on education, right? Make college free. That's a proposal that's often made. People say college is the new high school. Well, high school's free. It has been free for a long time. So that's certainly a direction to go. We all, economists will all tell you, education yields positive externalities. Like, well, let's go get those.
Yeah, I think, for in this case, part of the difficulty is that it's going to involve a much tougher inter-coalition fight among Democrats. So, for example, a recent bill was passed in Massachusetts, a permitting reform bill, to make it easier to build clean energy, green energy, other kinds of green projects. And one of the big things it's doing is basically mitigating local control over these projects, right? Really just reducing the amount of scope for busybodies and NIMBYs to just like one or two of them to just say no. But at the same time, the bill also establishes a trust fund to enable, environmentally impacted communities. I can't remember the exact language they use, but to enable people to sue the state over green energy, basically. And, where does that money go? Well, primarily, we're not talking about money that's going to citizens. We're not talking about money that's actually mitigating environmental impacts. We're talking about money that, in an accounting sense, is going to be spent on lawyers, on environmental groups, on various kinds of nonprofits, who are all, important democratic constituencies who have for a long time defined themselves ideologically and practically by operating in the current system of environmental regulation that we have. And so are kind of naturally going to be pretty resistant to changing it, right? Even if it might be better for everybody, it's going to be bad for them in some way, shape, or form. And so could be potentially a quite nasty inter-party fight.
I think I saw somebody suggest that it involves potentially going from a culture of saying no with regard to environmental policies to saying yes to environmental policies, right? It's
Yes.
no, we're going to block this, to yes, we need to build green energy. right, something like that, right?
Yeah, and that's a big cultural change,
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah.
I mean, for a lot of people, it kind of cuts against their self-conception, their sense that like I've spent my life on this. What I do is I have been saving the trees and the birds and the planet, and the way I do it is by blocking the system from building polluting, horrible stuff that's going to cut down trees and kill birds. And they want to build a giant bird grinding facility over there, and I don't want that. Except these days, we're not building giant bird grinding facilities. We're building wind turbines. We're building solar panels. We're building the factories that build solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and electric cars. And if we want to have all those things, they got to get built somewhere.
We're
Um,
wanting to build housing on the side of a parking lot, and we have environmentalists rolling up trying to defend the trees that are in the parking lot. And
yes.
yeah, no, that's a real anecdote from the last few years of Austin urbanism. I won't name names, but it's one of our favorites down here.
Yes. If you, like us, spend too much time in urbanist circles, you will just acquire an amazing list of these anecdotes of the things people will defend in the name of environmentalism, like parking lots. And the reasons they come up with are various, but at the end of the day, it's a parking lot, and we're trying to build more housing on it. So personally, I think this is a perhaps arguably a more better, more productive path forward in
These are
terms
the debates
of
we've got to have and win. To go for
that's
this
right.
abundance liberalism and win this argument within democratic circles.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's less clearly populist in the classic sense.
It's just more rising tide lifts all boats talk. Why is Samantha a neoliberal?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question.
You're a neon
Um,
liberal,
I
remember?
am a neon liberal. Exactly. It's
Mm,
completely different.
totally different.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, a lot of what we're circling around here, this whole debate is this hope that we could find the right economic program that will deliver political results, or excuse me, that will deliver economic and political results, right? That if we just get the economic package right, then it'll be good for everybody in a material sense, and people will recognize this and they'll vote for us and we'll be able to keep on doing it. And that's fundamentally that's what everybody wants. Yeah, that's what everybody's been looking for in terms of like the new democratic package, right? And Biden kind of governed on this an idea in this area that was sometimes called deliverism, which is the idea, well, you're going to deliver economic benefits to people and then they'll reward it for you for it politically. That hasn't worked out. Quite obviously. Some people have argued that's because he didn't deliver enough of the right kind of economic benefit. Other people have argued that it's well because he didn't communicate these benefits to the American people in an effective way, or these benefits were not communicated to the American people because of choices made by mainstream media or structures of social media.
I think I'm sympathetic to the view that there's an international post COVID anti incumbent tide, and that Biden and
Yes.
Harris swam against that tide better than anybody, which actually would be an argument in favor of deliverism and an argument in favor of what the Biden administration accomplished. I mean, I got to say, 9 months ago, meaning well in advance of this election, sure, Trump was polling ahead of Biden, but you had a lot of people on, in Democratic circles who were kind of fairly openly saying Biden's been a good president. And now that the election is lost, it seems like people are rushing to put Biden and Harris on the ash heap of history as failures. And I'm probably going to my grave thinking that that's deeply unfair, is kind of my view of it.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I mean, just it's just objectively true, right? This past year, across the developed world, incumbents lost elections. Whoever you were, whatever your party was, whatever you like, the Tories lost
Yeah,
huge,
yeah,
enormously. The
yeah.
Tories were almost wiped out in England
Why did
or
the
in
left
Great
screw up
Britain,
in England? No, I'm just kidding.
right?
The opposite,
Whereas,
apparently.
in America, we have the Democrats in power who are very much unlike the Tories in core respects, and they also lose, or at least they lose on the top of the ticket. So there definitely seems like there's this wave of anti-incumbent sentiment. Again, Biden and Harris do much better than many of their peer incumbents. Um, I think the point I would make here about deliverism is that if it did deliver benefits, these were not enough benefits to consolidate the electorate. right? Okay, maybe you run 3 or 4 points ahead of what you would have run without as much deliverism. I mean, that's big, right? In the context of an American politics that's always teetering on the edge of a knife, that's big. But it's not the sense of like, oh no, we finally arrived at a new economic program that is like delivering broad support across the electorate. That hasn't happened yet.
I mean,
Um,
I think we just see that there's an ocean between reality and perception. It just is. There's just enormous, and reality encompasses the idea that, well, things are better than they otherwise would have been, right? So to hold reality in your hand is to be judging what's happened against what would have happened if we had done things differently. So, like in a weird way, to judge reality well is to judge it against an alternative reality that never came to pass, which is in your mind, right? So,
mhm.
the distance from doing that sort of analysis, it's just that's hard. That's a bunch of thinking, and that's difficult to do.
Yeah, it
And
hurts my brain.
it hurts my brain too. And so in democracy, we need to be responsive to people. It's crucial. And people have to try to do their best to get a sense of what's going on. But I think we're always going to be kind of in this situation, where the
Yeah.
realities are going to be at odds with lots of people's perceptions. And we just have to continuously grapple with that.
No, I think this is a fundamental point about modern politics. Like you say, I mean, just politics generally, about this gap between reality and perception and what bridges it. Are there things we can do as a political party or as political actors or as organizers to like maybe bring them closer together? I think there's a lot of interesting proposals floating around about this, and maybe we'll get to talk about them in the future on this podcast.
Yeah. Can I
Um,
add one last thing as I hear you wrapping up and introducing
no, go
your
for it. Go
wrapping
for
up
it.
tone? And it's good. I just want to say, I'm guessing plenty of people will hear that last couple minutes segment as part of this response to the election, which is to say, oh, the economy was actually good and people just didn't grasp it. And I want to say that, like, things are far from being ideal. Things are always far from being ideal, and the economy could be a lot better. I wouldn't downplay, like, the negative effects of the economy over the last few years on people and the negative effects of inflation. They're very real. I think I might have mentioned this on earlier episodes, right? Like if you're sitting on positive net worth, as opposed to being a debtor, then inflation is no good for you. It just isn't. And that's a reality. And so when I was talking about reality versus perception, it's trying to say, like, this idea that the United States seems to have had a stronger recovery than pretty much anywhere else in the world, like that should be a point that's very strong in favor of the incumbents. It suggests they did about as well as they could in a situation that is legitimately bad. So no doubt perceptions are not just totally adrift from reality, and people rightly perceived that times were not so great. But I still would say, like, yeah, the really great best view of things would be to say that the incumbent party did pretty well. And that's just how I see it.
Well, as ever, we wander in a garden full of fog. And here on Neoliberalism, we try to draw on the best of the liberal tradition to maybe clarify the shape of things. But answers, well, they're elusive. So I hope you all join us next week as we continue trying to figure out this political situation, this world that we live in from a liberal perspective. So thanks, and we will see you all next week.